So, Craig, I'm going to pick on you first. You have a close relationship with the river. You worked as an ecologist in the Mildura region and Albury-Wodonga. What is it that you love about the ecology of the river? And can you tell us, from your perspective, what is a border in nature?
Yeah, thanks, Grace. Thanks for having me on this project. It's really good to be involved. When thinking about that question, I thought that the better question might be, do borders exist at all in nature? I was really struggling to think of any hard borders in nature, or at least the kind that we're sort of used to as humans. I thought about giant oceans and vast mountain ranges, but even those can be crossed by some, particularly daring species. I mean, certainly birds do not adhere to any borders. If we think about the Murray River as a border, there are many creatures that are more than happy to cross it. Kangaroos have been known to swim across. Snakes and goannas are actually quite comfortable crossing fast-flowing rivers. Even little insects or earthworms, if they fell in the river, they might end up washing up onto the other bank. So there's not much stopping them. And even if you really didn't like water, there are times that the Murray River has, before we dammed it up and controlled it, there were times where it would periodically run dry in places and you would literally be able to walk across it. So there's, I've seen images of that in Albury, I think it was. So it is hard to find borders in nature. Instead, what you do find in nature are what we call ecotones. And I really like this concept of an ecotone because it's a transitional area between two different vegetation communities. It's sort of like the grey area between your black and your white. And these areas are often more diverse than either of those communities alone, because you have elements from one side and you have elements from the other side, and that actually comes together to make a more diverse kind of community. These ecotones are like particularly visible around rivers because you have this transition away from a wetter, from the river into drier communities, and it's particularly relevant down in Mildura, where you go from wetlands, you go through red gum forests, you start moving into black box forests, you start moving into scrublands until you're eventually in a desert. But there's this continuous transition all the way through there. It's not just river stops, desert starts. But as humans, we do like to have clear-cut lines. We like our blacks and we like our whites, and we don't like these transitional sort of things. And so we put lines on maps, and we decided to use the Murray River in this case. And it can be a little bit silly in one way, as Mark alluded to before, because rivers aren't static or fixed in one place. They shift and move their banks on a time scale. We're not really dialed into geological time. As water scours out one bank, it deposits sediment on another bank, and the banks begin to shift and move. And if we could observe them at the pace that this happens at, we would see it wiggling and slithering like a snake or like a thread in the breeze. And it doesn't really make sense for a border to be able to move like that, but that's what we've chosen. And there are other reasons that it makes sense for river to act as a border, and it's because it is somewhere where people come together, communities come together, and there is some sense of equality and sharing to it, because both sides get to enjoy and appreciate that resource. You can meet there and come together, because the river is so important to all of our lives, and nature just thrives there. Nature, what do they say? Just add water, and life will thrive. And that's one of the big things that draws us to the river is the nature. It's whether it's the birds that catch your eye, or it's the fish you want to go chasing, or just sitting in the sounds of the wind in the trees and the trickling water. The river is where we go to connect with nature. And if that border happened to fall 1 kilometre on one side of the river, then the other side wouldn't be able to appreciate that. So there's that sense of equality and sharing by having it as the border. So yeah, that's just one of the reasons why I love the river. It's just this big interconnected system from one bank to the other and from the top all the way down to the bottom. Doesn't matter which part of it you choose to look at, you choose to focus on, the smallest ant or the biggest tree, it's all connected through these ecological interactions and physical interactions, and it links you to somebody else who might be looking at a completely different thing. But I could talk about this for far too long. That is what I'm here for. So there'll be plenty of opportunities for us to have chats about this stuff along the way. And yeah, looking forward to meeting some more of you more personally.
Great, that's beautiful. Thank you. Peter, I'm interested to hear your perspective on this concept and how what Craig has described can be applied to the body. What is a border in the body, and how can we dissect and question this idea?
Well, I think there's, as Craig was saying, I don't think borders exist very much unless they're declared by people. So we make lines on a map and call that a border, or we call a river a border. Whilst obviously if you looked at a river a different way, if you look, instead of seeing it as a line, you look along the length of it, it becomes something else. It becomes a flow or a way you can transport. Or if you look sideways at it, you can see how it can feed water to the banks and so forth. And if you look down into it, it's fish, you know. So borders are more or less made by people. And I think the same applies to borders in the body, where, like Craig was saying, I don't think there are many hard borders within the body. It's a system, a network of things. And there are membranes, walls between things in the body, but they're porous. So our bones, our flesh, all the internal things tend to be porous so that things can move both ways through them. You know, lungs take in oxygen and it goes through into the blood and then comes out of the blood back and we breathe it out. So for a start, those internal borders are sort of more or less invented for the sake of anatomy. You know, there are things you can pull out a heart, but the body needs these things to be functioning and dissolved. So that's the thing which interests me about working with the body, trying to use the body as a way of investigating how borders can be dissolved, so that we're not just an ordinary body like a stick figure, but we're a composite of cells and we can experience things more like that. I think too that the body is itself not separate, not bordered off from the world, because we breathe in air, we breathe out air, the skin's porous, we smell things, when we're outdoors, we feel as if we are outdoors, you know, not like we're a body over here and the sun shines over there. We feel like that we're part of that. So my interest is in finding ways to be more aware of that, about how we're tangled up with the place around us, and how our body has all sorts of things going on at different speeds and different scales, and trying to notice some of that more.
Beautiful. Thanks, Peter. Mark, we heard a little bit from you this morning, and I forgot to press record, so I might just get you to touch on that a little bit again. But I was thinking about how traditionally the river has been a meeting place in Aboriginal culture. Why is it important for us to reconnect to this post-border closures? You're on mute, Mark.
Where does one start? Just listening to this, the mind just boggles. It just races off to everywhere. Like borders being hard, borders being fluid. And I'm just in a mind boggle. It's like all this beauty that's coming out, and I don't want to be saddening this by any means, but it's just the emotion it brings us. Like I'm sitting here, and I'm just listening to all this, and it's just absolutely just so in depth, people's knowledge and people's expression. It's just exquisite. And while I'm enjoying all that exquisiteness, and this is not a dampener on it at all, but the river is also a very dangerous place. And I was just thinking about the people that have lost lives. And there's a beautiful statue on Town Clock where a teacher gave her life to save 3 students. So it's also brings sadness as well. And that was really emotional to read that young teacher from Kerrang in the very early settlement of Kerrang. But failing with beauty comes sadness. So I think the river is just a place where everything happens. All the beauty happens, sadness happens, life happens, death happens. And not dwelling on death as a negative, but the whole river is a vehicle to celebrate, and it does bring people together. But I'm also very mindful that some of the places that I really get a lot of whatever from is away from the river as well, when you're in that solitude, because the river is also a very busy place for our people as well. And we had wars and we had ceremony. We had like Wentworth, the junction, Murray-Darling Junction was a place where there was a huge ceremony, and people up to 700 k's away had come to celebrate. So that's sort of like our Olympics, and they are our Olympics. They're really big events. So I think the sharing, it allows us to exist. It's like all rivers in the world help us exist, and this one's there's nothing short of this river. It's a very long river, but it's just gives us life. And with life comes death. I don't want to dwell on the death side of it, but it's just a meeting place. Like I said, Murray-Darling Junction is a meeting place. So you go from, say, the Mildura Speedway, for those that know, and even beyond from basically the Mervine Cliffs to the Red Cliffs, except for a few little spots. It's one big meeting place, and that's just almost a continuous shell midden, and that's just one spot. And then you'll get a floodplain where the shell midden breaks, and where you get these breaks and these connections is what it's all about. But listening to the people, moving away from oneself and what I think, listening to what I've heard so far is just, you're onto something special here. And the Aboriginal community, because obviously I'm from that community as well, is something that if the pandemic brings this sort of thing together, I think the pandemic started a long time ago, and this is a way long before this COVID one. There's other pandemics, and this. I think this is something very special, that the contributors and how people can participate and feel worth and feel welcomed and celebrate and discuss things and maybe heal as well. So no, I'm really excited, very excited about this, and just listening to about how the body was. I'm thinking borders are fast, but I've just learned something today. Is borders are fluid, bones are porous, and I was thinking like the animal world, like a male goanna will know exactly as far as it'll go around a lake before it hits its goanna line, but then that goanna dies, and then that line changes with a new goanna. So this is really got goosebumps. So I'll shut up now.
That's great. It's cyclical. There's layers of cycles happening. Peter, I might throw back to you. Your practices focus on site-specific performance and a deep relationship to place. which we're really excited to see how that will apply within this project. Can you tell us about some of the work that you've done with the Environmental Performance Authority as an example of how you will work within borders?
Yeah, the Environmental Performance Authority is a sort of a pun on the Environmental Protection Authority. It began about 9 years ago, and place-based research is what we do. And then we do performances which try to involve participants in the same sort of experience that we've had in making contact with the place that the performance is in. So the performances are always a mixture of some sort of in-place performance, which is based on what we have researched with our bodies and our imagination, but also talking with people, talking with experts, talking with First Nations people, talking with whoever has a say in this, a connection with this place, to find out what all the layers of meaning are for people that make it a place. So we we make performances that are based on that research, but we also take people through the area and invite them to have sort of little experiences of the same sort of experiments we might do. It could be something really simple like standing with your eyes shut and listening. Or it could be looking at a river and being invited to look at the different speeds that you notice. Or it could be lying down in a spot that someone takes you to with your eyes shut and just noticing whatever you notice. So there's all sorts of small activities like that that we engage participants in the performances. I could actually talk you through some of that, showing you from a recent work, if you like.
Yeah, would you like me to share the images?
Yeah, yeah. So the group has all sorts of artists in it, theatre people, dancers, sometimes musicians, visual artists. Okay, so are people seeing one picture there or four? Four, okay. This was a COVID-based project, which was acting on the assumption that people during their lockdown in Melbourne would have discovered, because you were allowed a short walk within 5 kilometres for a short period each day. And we assumed people would have found new places or new ways of experiencing their place. And no one had discovered new places, and everyone, literally everyone, that we talked to had discovered new ways of experiencing their place because they walked less intentionally, or because they walked rather than drove, or because they took more time. So this was a project trying to unpack some of that and try to make sure that that continued in people's lives. And we worked in an area of Alphington which was very varied. It was beside a river. So it got a wasteland of industrial stuff, and it's got new apartments. So what you're seeing there on the top left is underneath a freeway, but that freeway was on the path of an old railroad that only lasted a few years. So there was a historical layer that we talked people through. The picture on the rocks, we were rolling down, took several minutes to roll down this bumpy thing, just because we enjoyed engaging our body with the rocks, I think. And then before that, at the bottom is a picture of how the performances work, that people are walking through the environment, and every now and again we'd stop and offer them some sort of sensory exploration that they could do. Picture on the right is a ukulele band that we discovered in a park during lockdown. So we invited them in. And then we also took the audience on a little task where they tried to walk as quietly as they could on those leaves, which crunched, which was just a way of heightening awareness of the environment too. There's some more pictures. And this is perhaps an example of another sort of research, because the picture, these are places on the way on that walk. So in the big picture is a deserted paper mill that's now having apartments built on it. So we talked through some of the history of that paper mill, which included one man who refused to move for 20 years, I think, when everyone else had sold up their stuff to the developer, and they let him stay there in his house. So up the top is a sort of a more expressive embodiment of this decayed place with a slumped body. Below is the new development that we found really appalling. So we took people past it, but told them there was nothing here, nothing to see here, which of course attracted everyone's attention to how appalling it was, and out of keeping with that environment. And down the bottom, in the river, doing some research, we discovered that this had been a community-built swimming access to the river, and that there was a famous woman called Annette Kellerman who used to swim in the river, was in movies in the early 20th century, was the first person to swim in a functional mermaid suit, was a pioneer for one-piece bathers, and a whole interesting history that we made into a little performance tableau. So it's just an idea of different sort of layers of research that we've done into the history as well as an embodied sort of exploration.
Great, thanks, Peter.
And if people are interested, you can see what the Environmental Performance Authority does at its website, which is just one long string, environmentalperformanceauthority.com.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing those images. There's an interesting comment in the chat from Gareth. Rivers help us exist, which is what Mark said. And knowing that many of the panelists work in embodied forms of performance being are the veins that allow bloods to flow, actually the rivers of the body. So the Q&A function is there. If you have any questions for the panelists, pop them in and we'll look at them soon. Vic, I'm going to move to you now. You're currently running the Case Incubator program, mentoring creatives in socially engaged practice. Can you tell us a bit about what you mean when you talk about socially engaged practice, and how can this apply to creative community response projects such as Borders?
Sure, thanks very much, Rachel. So the Case Incubator, which is a program that the CAD Factory is running, is really responding to a number of conversations we've had over the years with artists who might be practicing in a way that we might call socially engaged arts practice. And so, you know, that term socially engaged arts practice is a term that I find useful at the moment, but it's a complex term because it's kind of nebulous and it can have many different meanings, and it's always context dependent. And so, you know, a way to think through that is that, you know, usually traditionally we've thought through art forms in terms of, art form. And so, you know, we create communities of practice around things such as painting, and within painting we might have communities of practice around impressionism or abstract impressionism or some type of painting. Within dance we have, you know, communities of practice, and within that we might have communities of practice around body weather, for example. The difference with socially engaged practice is that it doesn't define an art form to start with. And so we're talking about something that you know, doesn't have that definition and that sort of way to come together for people, or for that way for people to have an understanding of what it is. You know, and that's often when we look to projects that are socially engaged, that's why we find a real diversity of art form practices, and often, you know, very complex sort of relationships and partnerships between people that are delivering them. And so, you know, why that's interesting in terms of this Borders project is because it starts talking about those borders between art forms as being porous as well, the way that we traditionally have siloed those off, or the way that we understand them. So we have opportunities to engage with fellow practitioners through our art form of body weather, for example. socially engaged practitioners don't have those ways to come together. They don't have those ways that have been sort of formulated over many years to come together and talk about the type of practice that they have. And so this case incubator program that the CAD Factory has developed, which this is the first year, and next year there'll be year 2. It selects 4 artists a year to come together for a year-long engagement process, and understanding from their perspectives what this term socially engaged practice means, because as I said, it's a term that I think has multiple different meanings. It has multiple different names. You know, this term of socially engaged practice isn't a term that everybody uses. But I think, you know, some of the key identifying features that I think about when I think about socially engaged practice is that it's an agile practice. You know, so as Elise, for example, earlier was commenting on that fractures that exist between the communities now of Albury and Wodonga across the border, how they're no longer two communities as one, but they're 2 separate and distinct communities. You know, my understanding of socially engaged practice is that within projects, we're able to respond and be agile to what we encounter, to the sort of nuance of what we encounter. And sort of underlying that, in terms of how I view socially engaged practice, is that is driven by ethics. And so, you know, an engagement with ethics, to me, in terms of my practice, I define socially engaged practice as being an engagement between my art form and the ethics of how I'm delivering that art form in relationship to people in place. And so that sort of, you know, constant renegotiation of what I'm doing and how I'm doing it is at play constantly in these things, especially if we're going into communities and working with people, especially if we're doing that around some subject matter that might be complex. In this case, some of the traumas that exist around border COVID closures, or some of the traumas that exist around the river due to ecological traumas or cultural traumas. And so, you know, they exist in so many layers. And so as socially engaged art practitioners, I think one of our biggest challenges is to ride that relationship between our art form needs, our funding requirements and our deadlines and all of that thing that drives the project, but also those things that we discover, those human essences and non-human essences that we discover as we're kind of practicing. And so I think what we're doing, what the CAD Factory is doing, and what I hope to do through this project is sort of advocate for socially engaged arts practices being a kind of a way of practicing art that is in deep engagement with the complexities of the world. It's not a studio-based practice, even though it relies on our ability to have a studio-based practice. But there's another sort of dimension there, and to me, that dimension is around ethics.
Great. And Linda, recently you've been facilitating workshops in severely fire-affected areas on the east coast of New South Wales, working with visual artists from a variety of backgrounds. So can you tell us about some of the methods that you use in your work to facilitate the recovery and healing process?
Yeah, thanks, Rach, and thanks for having me on the project and becoming involved. It's amazing just to hear what everyone's saying, and I'm feeling slightly like Mark said, my mind's just gone a little bit, well, so I'll just try and pull it back. I'm here on Dharawal country, which is in the beautiful Illawarra region, which is the coastal region just below Sydney, you know, like Wollongong kind of area. And it's a beautiful country to be part of. And then so a year ago, I was working with some visual artists, mostly visual artists, at the Urubadella Botanical Gardens. We worked there, which is a bush garden, really. It's a bush. And it was really decimated by the fires from 2 years ago. And so we had a 3-day short, what we called a micro residency. And there was just a few of us, half a dozen artists, and we, a bit like what Peter's saying, really, we just explored place. And I think what was most important for me in that process was time, and those activities like Peter was referencing, you know, just to do an activity, but it's also, we did talk and we discussed some of the traumas, and we listen, you know, we'll listen to each other. But the time in the not talking and being together to experience place just felt like a really, something else happens on the other levels that isn't quite so socially up here. And I think that was really valuable. And certainly the feedback was really valuable around that. So the activities are almost the excuse to be. So, and to dissolve, so we talked a lot about borders, dissolving the border, and I wanted to add to what Peter was saying, and also talking about identity as our identity, the construct that we make up about who I think I am, is a series of borders that change throughout a whole life, actually, because who I was at Linda Luke as a 10-year-old is almost like an historical artifact, you know. So we're changing all the time, and so the identity of as a kind of is of borders, and then try to dissolve that a bit, and so I like in workshops to encourage us to think more of ourselves as an ecosystem of cellular, blood flow, breath, but it's an ecosystem meeting an ecosystem that's the environment, and then sort of trying to shift through a series of activities from the body weather, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, because we've all been saying body weather and no one knows what we're talking about. But through this practice, there are kind of frameworks and activities to dissolve the ideas about who we think we are, like from an experiential point of view, or, you know, academically we'd say from a phenomenological point of view. So it's through experience. It's very hard to put into words, because I think it's something you do, you be and do, and it's about time. I think time has a big impact in that. So I just wanted to quickly say, Rach, if I could, about body weather. So body weather comes out of a Japanese, a beautiful Japanese dancer and choreographer called Min Tanaka, and it was developed during the 70s and 80s, mainly in Japan, with a group of international artists working with Min Tanaka. It's a dance performance practice. It's a synthesis of Eastern Western dance and theatre practice, Eastern philosophy and avant-garde performance. The central premise of body weather is that it's a never fixed, decentered, always transforming entity, influenced by and in relation to the environment. That's really what Min Tanaka was interested in. It was introduced, body weather as a practice was introduced in Australia by choreographer Tess De Quincey, and Peter and I have danced and have been part of the De Quincey company since, I don't know, 2000 or something, for many years. So I want to acknowledge that history with Tess and the practice that she shared with us, and her deep practice into place, which has been a profound influence on my practice. And I've learnt so much from her and from Peter. And also body weather. But what's really important to share here today is that it's a dance practice, sure, that it can go there. That's where it sort of is focused as a performance practice, but its underlying methods, approaches, philosophy, I think it can be applied to any arts practice. And that's why I love doing a lot of workshops, working with communities that aren't performers, but actually are just interested in place, body, self, relationship, in relationship with their art practice as well. So I just wanted to say that as well. I think that probably covers a million things I could say. It's so exciting.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to working with people.
So
yeah.
No, I'm glad that you went there, and you know, we're planning on running an online group as well as our in-person labs, which you and Peter will facilitate workshops as a part of that. And we are encouraging participation from a wide variety of artists, visual artists, performance writers, makers, musos, as well as those who may not even come from a creative arts background. So what's your experience been in facilitating these types of workshops, and how they influence the practice of those that are involved?
For me, Rach?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So Well, basically, it's as Peter said, I think it's about putting the identity of the artist to one side for a minute and just saying, let's come together. And, you know, Peter and I will be facilitating those workshops with Rachel and Mark and Craig being involved and everyone's input, a bit like today. But we'll set up some processes. We have to go to the river, of course, you know, we have to be there and be in place. And like I said, for me personally, I think it's really valuable, the conversation, absolutely conversation, but just as valuable is the being and doing without the speaking. It's so rare that as communities we're together without talking, and to experience together other things. And sometimes, like in the workshop, we might break into pairs, and so you might go elsewhere to do an activity. So then it's the two people. Sometimes it's the whole group. Sometimes it's solo. Did you want me to mention anything about the Zoom ideas, Mitch?
Yeah.
So there's the actual going for a few days in an intensive physical in-place workshop where we're all together, and then interspersed with that throughout the year, we're planning on doing some Zoom sessions where people we might give a presentation, but we also might we'll also debrief after the workshop, hear where people are at. Like a lot of the artists from the Eurobodalla Botanical Gardens, those artists talk to me later about the kind of work they were making from being inspired from the workshop and what came out for them. So we'd have conversations, sharings, looks at sketches, stuff like that. But also I was really excited about this idea of messaging, like sending off adventures. So I often do audio adventure files where you might put some earphones in by yourself after the Zoom session and spend an hour going back to place with some instructions. It might be written instructions or audio, and you kind of do a series of activities, but sort of maybe solo or with other artists from the community. So there's a series of different things that we're planning, different ways of keeping engagement going, because we can't all be together all the time. But also, I just wanted to quickly add that, Marie, the one thing that did stick out from the workshop with the fires, with those artists, was that they met that day, and most of them hadn't met in person, even though they all live in the same area, and that they knew each other on Facebook. So they were so excited to physically meet in person. And then they said after the workshop that they stayed in contact, and to the point where they've asked the curator down there at the gallery, and I'm going back to re-meet with them and some new people at the end of this year to keep that process going. So it did have quite an impact where those 6 artists stayed in touch, or they, you know, over that time, just because they'd met physically. So that was really great too.
Yeah. And it's great that we have multi-year funding for this project, because it allows us to indulge a little bit in having time to build those relationships and have multiple opportunities to hang out, whether it's physically or online. Vic, I just want to throw one last question at you as well. I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on the borders concept in relation to working as an artist across sectors. So, for example, your recent PhD work crosses over into the medical field. And within Borders, we're encouraging participation from people who may not have a background in creative practice. So how do you think that these modes of collaboration enrich our creative outcomes, as well as therefore enriching our communities?
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so I've undertaken the process of conducting a PhD as an artist in the Faculty of Medicine and Health, so the first ever artist to be accepted into the Faculty of Medicine and Health at Sydney University. So I'm trying to speak to 2 audiences, which is a really great sort of thing to center this conversation around, as I'm 7 months out of submitting my thesis. It will be examined by a facial nerve surgeon and an arts academic. And so the one document speaks to both of those people. So I'll talk to that, but I first just wanted to make comment because I think Peter and others have brought up this idea of the body, and in particular the medical body in terms of medicine. And, you know, that's within biomedical medicine, you know, the idea of borders within the body has been so strict, you know. So theorists such as Anne-Marie Moll, you know, talk about how the individual has a different meaning for every person that they see on their medical journey, that their purpose, their meaning, their wellness has a different meaning for, you know, whatever medical person they encounter kind of on their journey. And that sort of notion of borders within the body is so sort of entrenched in biomedical practices. But for, you know, a number of years, the World Health Organization have been pushing for a change toward biopsychosocial medical practices under the term of social determinants of health. So identifying that biomedicine and this classification of the body into different areas of plumbing, if you will, isn't the way that we should understand health, and that actually many of the greater health concerns that we public and global health are around, you know, social economic aspects, so things that are sitting outside of the body. And so, you know, it's a really great kind of position to put both my placement of the PhD, working with patients with facial nerve paralysis and working in a clinic. So while they're examined by a surgeon, they're also examined by me. You know, so that in that case is one way for me to enact a form of understanding the social determinants of health, understanding the individual as more than this series of practical and functional things that might go wrong and maybe someone can fix if they have the skill. And so, you know, my practice for so many years has been really deeply involved in this idea of partnerships. And what I find is, you know, sometimes we arrive at really similar understandings. So, you know, whilst we might think of a philosopher like Karen Barad, who talks about diffraction and diffractive practices through physics, meaning that the borders between things aren't solid, finite things, that things merge into each other. You know, so Karen Barad's concept of diffractive practice is similar to, you know, Craig's conversation earlier about, I think it was ecotones was the term that he used. So, you know, by bringing people together, we discover ways to talk about what we discover is often the same thing in really different ways through different perspectives. And so when we understand that the art world isn't still in a kind of, you know, romantic period or modernist period of art for art's sake, and that in this terms of this, that we are engaging with the real world, we understand that the world isn't just made up of artists. The world is made up of, what I find fascinating is really practical series of infrastructures. So I think the federal government have 7 portfolios that they sit all of the running of our community under, you know, whether it's defense, health, etc. And to me, the opportunity to engage with those, if these are the categories that we have for understanding how the world runs, you know, given that we are so affected by the practical running of this world and what people are or aren't given access to, you know, what we have the ability to engage with or not, how we're positioned in the world. You know, what a fascinating thing to actually say, if we're going to go out there and engage with communities, you know, we must therefore, you know, seek and invite in and ask for and value all of these different ways of viewing the world. You know, 2 or 3 people already today have mentioned, oh, already hearing different perspectives, my brain is just going like this. Here we talk to the value of partnerships just in our own responses, you know, when we talk about even the 4 or 5 of us or 6 of us who are here come from sort of different ways of working, you know, we're already finding that value. And so I think that it's through that sort of understanding, you know, think about how, I know if I engage with local council or with health or with universities or with arts organizations, you know, people always talk about those silos, you know, that exist, and yet don't do much work to actually breaking them down in a practical way. And I think this is, you know, if we acknowledge those silos, let's actually just chuck them away and let's invite in people and have these conversations that we're not always in control of because they're not always coming from our perspective, but we're usually always enriched by and then led by. You know, it's the leading of the merging of these conversations that I find really exciting. That sort of concept of I'm stepping into this place where I have a responsibility to end up in a year or two in the delivery of a show, for example, but I actually have no idea how that's going to get there because I'm bringing in so many partners that are going to lead these conversations in ways that I can't even predict yet. And so in the most hardcore of my thinking for my own practice, you know, I feel like if I don't leave myself completely open for that path to be forged through the relationships I build, then I am colonizing that community or that place or this art making with something preconceived that isn't of that place. And so I have to leave a sort of openness that is really scary at times, but is also then really rich, you know, by these different conversations and different perspectives. You know, we have learned many times that history, if we view history from one viewpoint, it's dangerous. And so, you know, it's our opportunity to enact a way of living and enact a way of practicing that values voices that we don't know or maybe can never comprehend, but we value them and we listen to them and we take them on board together.
Fantastic, thanks Vic. We've just got 2 minutes left. I found a couple of questions in the chat and there's a few that have come through on the Q&A. So what I'll do is make a note of those and I'll follow up directly with each of you. So just to finish up, so our upcoming dates are, can you see my screen now? Yeah, cool. Our upcoming dates, we're looking at having our first online session on the 8th of June, and our first research lab will be in Mildura from the 8th to the 10th of July. If you would like to stay in touch, please follow us on Instagram. You can check out the website. There's my email address there as well. And what we'll do from here is everyone who's attended or registered for today, this week I'll send a follow-up email with a copy of the recording and some more information about what events are coming up. And from there you can opt out from receiving those emails in the future if you wish, but that will essentially be the beginning of our contact list to start building our network of artists along the river. So
Rachel, there's just a quick question. Is there a target group for the online sessions by Lorraine Little? Do you want to just address that before we close it off?
Yeah, sure. What is there
on a target group for the online sessions? I think you just stay in touch through Facebook or something, did you say?
Yeah. So everyone will receive an email, a follow-up email to ask if they would like to be involved. But essentially we are looking at any artists or researchers or thinkers who are interested in pursuing this type of work around the river to join that group. Cool. So thank you to our panelists today and everyone for coming along. And we will be in contact soon.